Good morning. Thank you very much for having me along. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO of an organisation called OpenUK, which I suspect not many of you will have heard of, but some of you might. Anybody ever heard of us? 1, 2, 3. Great. 3. We're improving. We're only 3 years old, actually, so we're quite a young organisation. I'll tell you a bit more in a minute. So I got into open source about 15 years ago, and I joined a company some of you will know, Canonical, which was... We thought we were the cool kids in the block back then. We were the developer's choice of operating system, and we were the commercial sponsor of Ubuntu, which I guess some of you will still use today, but Canonical's remit has really broadened out since I joined them, beginning of 2008. And I was quite an early stage employee, and I joined them as a lawyer. I'm an ex-lawyer, if you can ever be an ex-lawyer. And I spent 5 years with them building that legal team and managing it globally. And I guess something happened which wasn't expected. So I'd worked in tech and I had quite a commercial background, which is why they brought me in to help commercialize the whole open source space for them and build revenue. And what wasn't expected was I really fell in love with open source. I suddenly found myself in an environment where for the first time in my life I felt like I belonged, and I was surrounded by these super smart engineers who taught me a lot about open source. Since then, I've obviously moved into different roles, but I've stayed involved with open source all the way through. And I found that my value set really matches the open source communities. Doesn't mean I like everybody or they like me, but our values just work together. So I've been involved in a number of different things. I chaired for the UN an innovation lab advisory on open source and IP. Now I'm on the Open Standards Board, which is a cabinet appointment. It's my sort of first official appointment. And I've dropped a slide somehow, but I normally tell people that I'm on the Open Source Initiative Board. I was elected onto that earlier this year. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I was in the US. It's all a bit of a blur now. I was in the US launching this book, and it has been the worst experience of my life and something I will never do again. It took 5 years to edit a book, and that's from sort of sitting down with the publisher saying, I think we need to do another edition of this book, trying to persuade my old professor who did the first edition to update it because the world has changed so much, and then getting 26 authors together and getting their content in. Now, most of them are lawyers, not all of them, maybe about 2/3. You imagine trying to manage 26 people who all have their own views on the world to get them to have a single voice across 640 pages. I would never expect anybody else to read the 640 pages. I wouldn't have done it if I'd known what I was getting myself into. I think I've done it about 5 times. Now, I'm not selling you the book. It's 75 quid. Somewhere in this deck, you'll find there's probably a discount code that takes it down 30%. If there's not, I can give it to Callum. But more importantly, it's open access. And it's open access non-commercial. And the link to that, you'll find that you can find it somewhere hidden. If you don't find it in the hidden spot, my website, amandabrock.com, has the open access really, really clear. And it's available open access non-commercial. I'm not going to say how they know if you're using it any other way. And we launched in Raleigh, North Carolina, with what's probably an unusually diverse panel. There are 7 female authors, and 6 of them happen to be 5 of them are American. So the 6 of us did a panel at All Things Open a couple of weeks ago, and then we did a book signing at Linux Foundation Members Summit in Lake Tahoe. And I'm sort of mentioning this to you because it's really odd. So the photographs from this panel and the book signing we did in Raleigh went viral on the Chinese internet. I mean, who knew? How do these things happen? So now it's been translated into Chinese, and I think it's going to come out in India as well. I spend a lot of my life doing this, moving around the world, talking during lockdown, a bit like Umbraco Together last year. I sat in my kitchen doing these kind of talks with a kitten who's now a very large cat and quite an expert in open source. I always knew I had an audience of 1, although I couldn't always be sure he was listening. OpenUK is an industry organisation, and it's about the business of open technology. And that sounds like we're not for any of you, that we're for your companies, and it's completely the opposite. So when you look at organizations that are geographically split for tech or for open source in particular, they tend to be about locally grown companies. And that doesn't represent the open source communities or the open technology communities. So what we do is we make ourselves about the business of open source, open technology, so anybody who is interested or working in that space is welcome to participate in our activities. And we work with people who work in UK companies, the homegrown, which are obviously important, but also from companies from all over the world, tech, non-tech, open source, non-open source. And our purpose is up here to develop UK leadership and global collaboration. It started as UK leadership because we really wanted to focus locally, but we're not at all xenophobic. And if you look at our makeup, which I'll show you in a minute, it's about half international people who are based in the UK. So we changed it after a year to be more embracing of that international collaboration, because any of you in open source communities, you will be working with people all over the world. As Callum was saying, you know, you're currently quite a UK focused community, I believe, but it's trying to broaden it out. And that's really important. We are one of the most diverse organizations in UK tech and in open source globally. It hasn't been entirely premeditated that we've ended up that. And I think some of it is just having a female leader attracts other women. We're not as ethnically diverse as I would like, and we've just brought someone in to try and help change that. And we're made up of volunteers. 2 of us are now employed. We got our second full-time employee in September. As I said, we're 3 years old. We have 130, nearly 150 volunteers from our board across our leadership team who all work pro bono. And then we've got a bunch of ambassadors. We're about to bring on international ambassadors and what we're calling apprentice ambassadors, so people earlier stage in their career who will match with ambassadors to try and help them become part of that leadership. And we focus on 3 things: community, legal and policy, and learning. And community is quite a broad thing, right? And you can never say the open source community because it's like all of us and many, many more. So it's sort of a community of communities. So what we've tried to do is bring together leaders from each of the communities that we come across, that we find, bring them in as ambassadors, participants, and then they take the messaging out to their communities too. And by doing that, our goal is to build this sort of cohesive voice across open in the UK. And we don't just focus on software, it's software, hardware, and data. So we try to bring those voices together so that we can influence laws and policies. And in doing that, what we achieve is an ability to have influence. And in 3 years, it started with us banging on the doors of DCMS and government and being totally ignored. I wouldn't say it was a very particularly well thought out strategy that got us through the door. I wrote an article 2 years ago saying, where's the UK's digital strategy? And suddenly all the people who'd been ignoring us came back to ask us about it, which was a bit of a surprise, but you can never work out how these things are going to happen. We've been very quickly recognised outside the UK as the sort of voice of open from a policy and law perspective. And we don't just focus on what UK government and the devolved nations are doing, we also try to speak to international governments. So we responded to the Biden ordinance on security in 2021, and we also joined as in an amicus brief when the Google v Oracle litigation on APIs was happening in the US. So we realized that to persuade government that they should take a more open policy, a more open approach to policy, we needed to start providing reporting. And last year we did 3 reports. This year we've managed to publish, this has been a really hard year to get things done. We've published 1 part of our report and the second will be out at some point before Christmas. And what we did was we split the data that you can already get about open across the globe by the UK, and a lot of it hadn't been gathered historically for the UK because we're still part of the EU. So as we've done that literature review, as we've talked to people about the data they hold, we've managed to persuade them going forwards to start to put the UK in a separate box so you can see it. And it's important. A piece of data I'm not allowed to publish, but I'm not under NDA, is that the European Commission, when they were doing their reporting in 2020, they were using figures from 2018, and the figure they had was that there were 490,000 developers across Europe doing open source. When we Brexited, they changed that number to 260,000 for their calculations. So you can see why they won't let me publish it. They won't even let their people formally give me that data. But it shows that almost half the developers across Europe who are recognized, and they use things like GitHub data to get that, are based in the UK. And if you look at how that breaks by country, it goes to Germany next, who we generally think are the biggest because they're better at publicizing it than we've been. And then there's a big drop to France, and then the rest are just little pockets across Europe. Netherlands is quite good, but it's pockets. And I think that's interesting because we don't recognize the fact that we are so important in this space. If you look globally, we're number 5 in contribution in almost every project, occasionally a bit higher, not very often lower. So these reports are written in a way that if you want someone who doesn't understand open source to understand it, it's sort of an introduction and engagement. We go from the literature review explaining what's happening across the globe and here, to doing a survey. That survey then we analyze to get some stats, and then we use case studies. By the time we get to the third report, we start to look at the values. So not just the economic value, but the societal values of open source, which I think for everybody who engages in open source really matters. So things like the skills development, the collaboration value, the ability to help people in third world countries where they not just get the software, but we can help them build communities and learn how to use packages that other people would sell them. So there's some really interesting stuff in that. This is from this year's report. I have no idea what time it is. You need to try and keep me on time. This top left, that figure was based on assessments of contribution. So how many hours your company spends doing open source, that kind of thing. And we have an economist from the Office of National Statistics who is seconded into us to help with this stuff. So we're really using sort of cutting edge assessment. And it's the kind of assessment UK Gov is trying to use on technology to look not at what goes in, so not at lines of code, not at number of developers and total cost of ownership or contribution that you would historically see, but the value generated. And in doing that, you get to this 4.87 to 6.65 billion, quite a big span. But the interesting bit about that number is it's 29 to 30 times the amount that the UK government has put into digital in the Levelling Up Fund. I mean, that's huge, and that's what all of us and our businesses are contributing currently. And then I think down in the bottom left, it breaks my heart, but number 1 is always the fact, I'm right in front of that, sorry, the fact that you have cost saving. So whatever I try and do, however I try and restructure questions that we ask people, they always come back with cost saving being number 1. Now, in the current economic climate, we can almost guarantee that you are going to see government start to shift back to open source. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we had the world's first open source first policies in the UK. Big announcements. You're probably mostly too young to remember this. Francis Maud was running he was the cabinet minister for I can't remember what department it was, but he was the cabinet minister running that at the time, and they went to this open source first strategy. It's been replicated all over the world, and then it's been ignored. And what was wrong with it was we didn't have teeth, so we couldn't force people to use open source. Now I'm going to talk to you a bit about what's happening in the world. So you see this journey across the UK, and you see this journey across potentially your customers, your partners, the people that get into open source. And one of the things that we tried to do in the last report that's kind of difficult is look at how long people have been doing use, collaboration, contribution, and distribution. So as you go through those different pieces, you see different behavior patterns. And the longer an organization has been doing each of these, you can correlate different behaviors. Those behaviors tend to be around good practices and governance. Very quickly, because I need to wrap up in Open UK and talk to you about what I'm really meant to be talking to you about. Security is really high on the agenda for everybody. And it's really high on the agenda because of digitalization, whether you're an enterprise or public sector. Some of the things happening in the last few years that I'm just about to touch on have really put it up the public sector and government agenda. We wanted to share information and we're finding it hard to connect. So we put together something called the Summer of Open Source Software Security, which is a bunch of webinars and podcasts. It's a never-ending summer because we're still adding to it. But that is a really good resource if you have anybody who's interested in security and open source, or even just digital generally and security. It was sort of recognized, I still find this bizarre as well, it was recognized as one of the most important initiatives in open source this year. So then we had. So we also do quite a lot around sustainability, and we delivered last year a blueprint on data centers, making data centers up to 70% with a 70% reduction in carbon emissions using open. Just the kind of software we have available, the kind of technology, containerization, opening up the hardware, specification allows you to make these massive reductions. This year we're about to deliver one on EV charging. And next year, we're going to go out to a competition for other people to build those blueprints. Third part we haven't done so much this year, is education. We've got 2 kids courses using Imogen Heap's Digital Glove for Kids. And they teach open source, they teach coding, and they teach sustainability. I haven't told anybody else about this, so I signed a contract that's the biggest contract OpenUK has ever signed, and we've got 4 floors, so we've got ground to floor, ground to 4 of the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre in Parliament Square, which is quite a lot of space. We've also got the outside, and we've got a planning permission application in process to build teepees on the lawn outside overlooking Parliament. Whether we'll get away with that is another thing, but we've got that whole space on the 7th and 8th of February. And we're planning a conference called State of OpenCon. It will have plenaries where we try to bring the conversation about international funding of open source and the future of open source. We know we've got the UN involved. We're hoping to have UK Gov and international governments on the stage for the start of it, because there's a whole conversation going on that policy stuff that the engineers aren't hearing. And I want to make sure that we bring everybody together. So this conference is designed for engineers community, it's designed for enterprise, it's designed for public sector, and it's designed for government. And that's an unusual mix, because it always ends up with us in silos, not having a joined up conversation, and we're trying to facilitate that. So the conference will be first day, sort of 10 to 12 plenaries on that topic, and then there's 7 rooms. There's an unconference where people can put their own talks in. There's a platform engineering room, a security room, there is an entrepreneurship room, which I don't think anybody will ever have seen before. And I think I will have 20 founders, some UK, some international. I've got people like Adam Jacob at Chef coming, Peter Zeistev for Percona. We will have some quite well-known names. And the room will be laid out, I'm telling you all of this because I think you might be interested. The room will be laid out with 20 tables with 1 founder on each table. And we'll do 45-minute panels and then 45 minutes for people at those tables talking to the founders. And we'll try and make sure everybody rotates through the 2 days. It wasn't meant to be the main room, but it's the one I'm becoming slightly obsessed with. So platform engineering, security, entrepreneurship, open data, open hardware, and government law and policy, as well as an unconference. Tickets are 200 quid, which frankly will not cover the catering, assuming that the catering all works out. We've got quite a lot of sponsorship, and we aim to get a lot more, and it's about bringing people together. So we're looking to get 1,000 to 2,000 people in the building for those 2 days. So please, it'll be live next week. I'll make sure I share the site. If 200 quid is still not accessible, there will be diversity tickets and scholarships and things. I've got to fundraise to put that in place, and that's my next step now that the contract's signed. So what I'm really meant to talk to you about, I'm going to have to go very quickly. What have I got, 15, 20 minutes? You want me to keep going? Okay. So when I joined OpenUK 3 years ago, I was drawn into it because of what was going on in Europe. And I initially said I didn't want to get involved because I thought it was xenophobic having a geographical organization. And the geographical organizations are so traditional. And then I watched Brexit happening, and I realized that everything was powering ahead in Europe, and there was no evidence of that here. So I agreed to do it so long as I could do what I wanted. And the first thing I did was bring this board in and start to bring this community together and this big group of people. But at that time, Europe was talking about its digital decade. And we saw I never use words on my slides, but we saw Ursula von der Leyen talking to Margrethe Vestager. This is the appointment of Margrethe Vestager. Vestager had been the competition commissioner for nearly 10 years. And she was reappointed as competition commissioner, and also as the VP of digital for Europe. Now, she's one of the few people anywhere in the world who really understands what the money flow in tech is, because she's been investigating these companies with whole teams of people taking them apart for so many years. And not many really understand what's going on in the background. So she also understands where that digital economy is going. And you see this whole conversation coming out of Europe around sovereignty, around data sovereignty, around digital sovereignty. And it's really important for all of us. So this is FOSDEM. Do any of you go to FOSDEM? So FOSDEM is the Free and Open Source Developer European Meetup. And it normally has 18,000 developers. It's free. Our conference on the 7th and 8th of February is designed to follow it. So it'll be back in person this year on the 3rd and 4th of February. It has just opened, I think, 80 rooms with a call for papers. So my inbox is just full of these emails I'm deleting with CFPs, but you'll find under FOSDEM, you should probably have a room there next year. It's probably the most important European conference on open source. We were at it in 2020, and it's always the first Sunday in February. So that can be January, February, it just moves. So we were there on the 31st of January, and a bunch of the British people went to the commission at midnight. Actually, there was quite a lot of international people too. And the reason I put it in here is that what's happening is we see all of this digital stuff going on in Europe, but actually it could be anywhere in the world, right? So the words that Vestager uses in appointing, or von der Leyen uses in appointing Vestager, you could swap that. You could swap, and you could talk about our children's future in the UK, or in the US, or in Asia, or anywhere in the world, because this is a really important, pivotal moment. And it's about geopolitical shift and digitalization and the combination of these two things and what they mean. And for us here at that moment with Brexit, what you see, I think, is the single clearest point of geopolitical shift that you're ever likely to see. You can put that to the second, and you know exactly when we Brexited. Whether you wanted it or not, we've got it, it's what we have to live with now, but that's when it happened, and everybody knows that. The awful thing was, we were standing outside and the commission put the lights out, and I don't know if they do that every night or whether they just did it because of Brexit, but it really, really felt poignant. So we see Europe going through this geopolitical shift, and then we see people in the UK and beyond going through COVID, and this is the Scottish variant. I don't know if you'd be familiar with it, but you hear it coming. In Europe, we then see them not just talking about this sovereignty piece, but actually starting to make it reality. And that goes through legislation from the Commission and the Parliament, but also from case law. And we see this case in the European Court of Justice with Schrems. Now, Schrems is an activist, and this is his second case. The first one had something called model clauses that lawyers would just stick into every contract, and it would allow you to move data from Europe to the US or other third countries. This was set aside in Schrems 1, not valid, and Schrems 2 sets aside the whole sort of safe harbor piece, which said the US was a safe place to send data. So you're actually starting to see practically the European Commission and the European Court putting its money where its mouth is and stopping this shift of data to the big tech companies in the US. We don't just see it at a government level. They set up something called GaiaX. OpenUK was one of 2 UK members, day one members of it. And GaiaX is building a cloud for Europe. It's a physical infrastructure being built by business. Whether they're doing very well is extremely debatable, but they're trying to build this infrastructure around cloud. It's got a lot of big, BMW, Deutsche Telekom, people like that involved in it, and it had 90 million to build this platform. I don't know whether we can really say it's open source, but the intention was that everything was to be open sourced. And you're not just seeing this sort of activity against the US and Europe, it's also with China, and then it's with the US and China, and the UK and China. And it's not just at a government level over the last 3 years, it also goes to the citizen level, to the activist level, with Black Lives Matter, kids on the streets at COP26, and then this year the war in Ukraine. Now, in some ways you might think I'm off on a tangent, but this really matters to us. And it matters to us because of digitalization and open source. And I'm going to go back a step and ask what's open source and why it matters. So if I was to ask you what open source is, I'd probably get a bunch of different responses based on your experience, right? If you're a community person, you're probably going to say it's a community collaboration. If you've been part of one of the big business projects, like this OpenStack, something like that, you were probably involved through a company. It has different lenses depending on your experience. And one of the things I learned at Canonical was that there is generally a legal definition we can agree on, and that's that the source code is shared and it's on an OSI-approved license. That of itself isn't enough, but it's a start point, right? And if we can get everybody agreed on that, it seemed like that was going to be the fix, and it hasn't been. And we've got everybody agreed on that in terms of the public sector, that they will use those definitions. But when you look at what that is, this is the open source definition. Can anybody recite it? So when I'm in rooms of people that are supposed to be like lawyers and stuff around open source, I always say, right, let's recite it together. And none of us can. I can't tell you what all 10 definitions are. And if I'm really honest with you, Bruce Perrins, who wrote it, was in London a few months ago, and we gave him one of our kids' camp things that's got a crib sheet, and he was using that because he can't remember all 10. And some of it's more important than others. For me, 5 and 6 are the bits that I always remember. And this is fundamental to open source and understanding what it's all about. And it's no discrimination against persons or field of use. And there's often confusion about that because other parts of open, like Creative Commons, have non-commercial licenses. But for open source, you cannot restrict who's going to use your code or how they use it. So they can go make money from it, right? When I left Canonical, I spent a couple of years in a law firm. I was too early stage, but I was trying to advise open source companies. And I used to say to founders who said they wanted to open source their code, what if? What if someone else takes that code? Well, they kind of knew that that's what open source was. What if someone takes it and makes money out of it? And you could see people start to flinch. They weren't sure about that. And what if someone else takes your code and makes a lot of money out of it? Well, actually, that's the big risk. And I've just been through that in Canonical. And it can be heartbreaking for a founder who's invested a lot of money to see that happen. So don't open source it. If you can't live with that, and that's not something that fits your business model, don't open source it. And you have to go off and work out your business model because open source isn't one. So this piece about what open source is fundamental to our understanding. But it really matters because today, something like 48 to 98% of code bases are open source. And 90% of all code generated is open source. Depends on whose reports you go to look at, but what we can sort of conclusively say is the majority of codes produced is open source. Now, 10, 15 years ago, we were trying to persuade people to use open source, and it was really tough. And now that's not the issue. And it's not the issue because of digitalization and a couple of changes. So with digitalization, what's happened is the engineers, the developers, suddenly have a much more elevated status within organizations, and they don't have to go through legal, procurement, finance to get their code, because they can simply go to GitHub or GitLab and they can bring it into the organization, and they entirely bypass that whole structure that we were trying to negotiate with back in the Canonical days. And that makes it much easier, right? And it's had an impact, and the impact is this massive adoption of open source. So now what we see is open source just permeating our businesses and our public sector. If you look at cloud native, you also find that the platform economy, the cloud space, that's had a huge impact too. And if we're looking at anything that's digitalized, which today is everything, what we've got is a software-defined world, and if it's software-defined, it's open source-defined, and if it's open source-defined, it's going to have developers and engineers bringing that code into the organization. So we're now in a world where Linus and I would tell you open source has won, but has it? Well, you could trust me in Linus, I reckon, but Microsoft, now there are one or two people who might be my age group in the audience. Do any of you remember when Microsoft was public enemy number 1? Yeah, okay, so I know loads of jokes, but I can't tell any of them. No, it's not because they're bad. It's because the punchline was Microsoft for every single open source joke I know. And now they are potentially, depending on whose figures you believe, the number 1 contributor to open source anywhere in the world. And I showed you that picture of a journey before. Organizations go on a journey. And this guy here, Steve Wally, is a long-term open source guy, and he's keynoting Linux Foundation Open Source Summit in Edinburgh in this picture. And Steve's talking about the journey that Microsoft's been on, and he's got Satya Nadella behind him saying, judges on the actions we're taking and will take, as opposed to Steve Ballmer saying open source is a cancer. So Steve Wally explains this for 3 reasons. And the first is the developers. So younger developers or developers who've learned to code in the last 10, 15 years use open source. They just can't understand why you wouldn't. And if you want to hire them, you have to use it. Second thing is their cloud product and the fact that you can't work in cloud without working with open source, and it's no good just to take it. You have to be able to engage with communities. And then the third is customers, and that customers actually ask for the technology now. So it's not altruistic, but we've seen one of the biggest journeys in history around open source. And what Microsoft used to be known for was FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, a lot of litigation, a lot of competition authority stuff. Just because Microsoft is on board now doesn't mean that's over. And I'm going to very quickly, because I still can't see any time anywhere, but I'm sure I'm over already. 2 minutes, okay. So there are still problems with FUD. And the FUD today, I've picked 3 things that are quite important. Any of you see Elastic and Elasticsearch move to SSPL? SSPL is not an OSI approved license. The opposite of open source isn't closed source. Now, take that thought away and think about it. The opposite of open source is proprietary. You can still have code that's open that isn't open source. You can share the source code, you can share the human readable stuff without it being open source because it doesn't meet those values that engage me at Canonical, the values around community and not locking people in over time and creating things that are for all of us, creating more equity in tech. So what we saw with Elastic was Shay Bannon writing this blog post about doubling down on open, which is really disingenuous, right? I don't know him well, I have spoken to him, and he's a long-term open source guy, so it's not like he doesn't understand, but he writes doubling down on open when he means moving away to proprietary. We see it still happening, and we see Lightbend and Akka doing this a couple of weeks ago. And there's no problem. If you don't want to be open source anymore, you can't take back what you've done, but you can make your future releases proprietary. That's fine, but just be honest about it. Don't mislead people and don't mislead communities. So I think this is something you have to be really wary of if you're contributing. And you see it particularly around single vendor products where the community isn't healthy. The community is based on their own employees only. So it's worth watching out for if you're contributing. Not going to dwell on it, but the war in Ukraine, I have friends there and I was asked to get involved in protestware, which restricts who can use. And if you go back to that open source definition, 5 and 6, you can't restrict who uses. It was quite hard to say no to getting involved and to say that there'll be other wars, and there have been other wars, and what we build is for everybody, and we can't, from a coding perspective, get involved. We did then set up a Red Cross fund for open source, and we put 1,000 in ourselves. We don't have a lot of money, but we put 1,000 in ourselves and tried to encourage others. And there's a problem going on in the standard space, and it's quite a nuanced and complicated problem where standards bodies, particularly around telcos, use patents, and they use standard essential patents. And what happens is the telcos engage in the standard setting. They've got lots of money, lots of time, lots of reps at those, and they encourage standards to be set that include their patents, and then it just does not work well with open source that you have to pay these royalties. So I'm going to flick through this and get to a point of talking about why open source matters. I've talked to you about digitalization, I've talked to you about why it fits into that big picture and how all this geopolitical shift impacts us. Here in the UK and across the world now, what we're seeing is open source not just adopted across business, but the public sector. And we're seeing it in our national infrastructure and our national critical infrastructure. So this is, the policy 10, 12 years ago. We then see GDS celebrate its 10th anniversary. We go through the pandemic and we see things like the apps. Not holding our app out as being particularly good, but it was open sourced. Germany did a much better job. They took a couple of thousand contributions into theirs. The health sector, the energy sector, they're all going towards open source, accepting that that's what we've got. And then you see things like this, Atlantic Council staff writing that our infrastructure, our digital infrastructure is built in a house of cards because open source isn't secure. You see the Biden ordinance in the US where they start to understand what open source needs to be secure. There was a guy in the White House, a guy called Dave Ricordan, who was the CTO until about a month ago, and he was involved in this. So if you ever want to see how government ought to be reacting to security and open source, this is where to go. And the European Commission has just lifted and shifted it into the Cyber Act. UK doesn't have a position on it yet, but hopefully at some point it will. And what they're talking about is software bill of materials and supply chain. So we've seen all of this stuff in the last year around Log4j, around Shell4j, and the problems that you have with security. We've talked about things, the geopolitical shift, that are just going to make this more and more under the spotlight. And what we see and what we know is it's not the developers, it's not the people creating the open source that are responsible, it's the user. And what we have to do now is we have to educate the politicians and we have to educate the public sector to understand that so that the laws stay that way. I tell you, I regularly hear people talking about regulating open source or regulating coding, and it's a freedom of speech, right? It's a way to express yourself. They can't do that. What we need them to do is to regulate use cases and understand that the end user is who's going to be responsible for how they curate. And you're going to hear that term a lot in the next few years, curation of open source. And it's how you take it from the community on this side of the road to the users and the infrastructure on this side of the road and allow them to cross the road safely. And of course, there's different ways to do that. And what I think we need to see, now that open source is recharacterized as a digital public good, not just as being in the commons, which it always will be, but something that we need governments to start to contribute to put funding into, to put resource into, but to do it in a joined up, structured way. I mentioned State of OpenCon. For me, the point of us putting this on and all the work we're doing is to have those 2 hours at the beginning where that conversation happens with international governments and where we start to take some leadership on it from the UK. And many of you may know, many of you may not know that this is the year of the tiger in Chinese horoscope, and it's also been a bit of a year of open source tiger, but we want to see that continue in future years. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm sorry, I've got no idea how long I've been talking to you. It is a bit of a risk.